Son of Heaven. Why is that idea so unimportant? Okay, so recently I've been thinking a lot about this idea of the Son of Heaven. If you read anything about Chinese history or Vietnamese history, and Vietnamese history is what I'm going to be talking about here, the idea that emperors in the past thought that they were the Son of Heaven is something that gets mentioned, but we rarely go deeper than that. And you know, it's not something that makes up core ideas for our understanding of the functioning of, say, the Nguyên Dynasty in the 19th century, and yet it's something that is central. And so this is a problem I'm trying to figure out. In looking at things, I think there are various reasons. Okay. In looking at this issue, I think that there are various reasons why we don't take this idea of the Son of Heaven as seriously as we should. And all of those ideas are related to the emergence of what we refer to as professional history, the field of professional historians or professional history. So the first people to investigate Vietnamese history and Chinese history and to write about it were missionaries. By and large, were missionaries. Missionaries were very, very interested in this idea of the Son of Heaven. They saw these guys, the Chinese emperor and the Vietnamese emperor, who performed sacrifices at this sacrifice called the Nanjiao or Nanjiao in Chinese, where the emperor supposedly made offerings that essentially facilitated the connection between heaven and his own ruling and the realm. And they looked at this and they were really, really interested in this because they wanted to know, what is it that these guys are worshiping? Is it a god? If it is a god, is it the same as the Christian God? And they also discovered that as part of this Nanjiao sacrifice, not only did the Chinese and Vietnamese emperors make offerings to heaven and to earth, but they also made sacrificial offerings to their dead ancestors as well, which to the Christian missionaries, they're like, well, that's a little weird. That's kind of like idolatry. So maybe this isn't really a religion, and on and on and on. So there are a lot of writings from the late 19th and early 20th century about both China and Vietnam, where people coming from this more religious perspective, including missionaries, are looking at this and wondering what is going on, because they could see that this was something very, very important. The Nanjiao sacrifice was the most important sacrifice in the imperial world. And you know, these guys really wanted to know what that was about. So if those guys thought this was so important, why don't we think it is so important? And if they wrote articles about this, where are the articles that modern professional historians have written about these things? The problem is we haven't been looking at these things and we haven't written about them. And I think part of the reason is because modern history, or the profession of modern history, emerged in some ways in contrast to the world of amateur historians, many of whom were missionaries. And I think one of the things that modern historians started to do was to distance themselves from the topics that missionaries had looked at, because they saw those things as maybe not professional, or maybe just wanted to distance themselves from the things that these amateur historians had examined. Another problem has to do with exoticization or Orientalization, Orientalism. Perhaps the person who made this idea of the Son of Heaven the most famous for Vietnam to the English-speaking world is Francis Ford Fitzgerald. Is her middle name Ford? I think so. Who wrote a book called Fire in the Lake in like the 60s, or was it early 70s? I should check this stuff before I make a video. Anyway, she wrote this book. She was essentially not a professional historian, but a journalist. and she relied heavily on the work of a French scholar by the name of Paul Mousse, who had tried to kind of figure out the essence of the Vietnamese world and had looked at things like the idea of the Son of Heaven and the mandate of heaven and how villages worked and things like that. And what Frances Ford Fitzgerald, I hope her middle name is Ford, what she wrote in this book in the 1960s was essentially trying to show that the Vietnamese have their own logic of how the world works, and that they have this idea of the mandate of heaven where the ruler, the Son of Heaven, gets this approval from heaven to rule, and the people all recognize this. And essentially what she tried to do is argue that this is something that existed in the past. It continues to exist today because Vietnamese culture is timeless and unchanging, and that in the modern age, it's the communists who were receiving heaven's mandate, and the people recognize that, and therefore the Americans were supporting the wrong side. It's all a big mistake, etc., etc., etc. So there are many reasons why we can sort of challenge the work of Fitzgerald, and it has been challenged and it's been beat up. But I think in the process, the fact that she used this idea of the Son of Heaven and of heaven's will and all of this stuff is another reason why we don't really take this seriously now, is because through work like Fitzgerald's, we've come to associate it with this kind of essentialized, unrealistic view of Vietnamese history and culture. Then around the same time, you had people like Alexander Woodside, who's very well respected. He wrote a book that was published in the in the 70s. First it was his dissertation, then it became a book called Vietnam and the Chinese Model, in which he looked at Nguyen Dynasty administration. And in that one, he does talk about the Son of Heaven idea a tiny bit, but here again, it's not really taken all that seriously, but for a different reason. What Woodside was doing, he was influenced by the rise of Southeast Asian studies at that time, and essentially what he tried to argue is that you have a Vietnam, which is true, and you have a Chinese model, which is something imported from outside. And he looked at the way that Nguyen Dynasty administration, as he saw it, tried to fit this Chinese model onto a Vietnamese reality. And the point of his book was to say it doesn't really fit. And in the process, I think the idea of the Son of Heaven is understood, or I think if you read the book, you'll see that as yet one more element of this Chinese model that just doesn't really fit the Vietnamese world. It's this thing that isn't indigenous, and therefore it can't really take root, and therefore we don't really need to take it all that seriously. Then finally, I was recently reading a work that historian Nguyễn Thị wrote way back in like '86 or something. It's a really good article published in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, in which Nguyễn Thị looks at the interactions between the Nguyen Dynasty court and the French from about 1885 until I think 1945, and essentially documents the ways in which the French took political power or control of many parts of the government away from the Nguyen Dynasty, until by the time of Khải Định, Emperor Khải Định death in 1925, I think Nguyễn Thị argues that basically control of everything except for ritual had been taken away from the Nguyen Dynasty. And so the idea here is that ritual, things like the Nam Giao sacrifice, which continued to be performed, that stuff is not important because it's not real power. The real power was taken away. And again, I think in putting forth arguments like that, that's yet another piece of evidence or another kind of approach that leads us to sort of not take seriously those rituals, those sacrifices, the idea that the emperor was the Son of Heaven and he had to perform these sacrifices to keep everything in balance. That's just this kind of ritual stuff that doesn't really matter. The real stuff is the actual political control. The Nguyen had lost that. The rest is not important. So recently I've been reading Nguyen Dynasty documents from the late 19th century. And the one thing that really jumps out is that the Son of Heaven idea, the idea of the importance of heaven, the idea of the importance of the Nanjiao sacrifice, it's enormous, huge. It is the most important thing in there. And indeed, in the ways that the Nütten compiled information about their dynasty and their institutions, that stuff is always at the forefront. It is the most important. And if you look at it from that perspective, if we get to 1945 and find that Khải Định only had control of rituals left, that's all the guy needed. That was the most important thing for the dynasty. You could not be a monarch if you did not have that divine connection to heaven. And in 1925, or going into the next era with Bảo Đại, that connection still existed. But we can't really accept this because we don't take this idea of the Son of Heaven seriously. And we don't take this idea seriously, what I would argue, for all of these earlier reasons. It's because missionaries talked about it, and missionaries, they're bad. It's because Fitzgerald talked about it, and Fitzgerald is bad. It's because Woodside talked about it, and he's good, but the way he talked about it implied that this wasn't important, and the same goes for Nütten. But none of these people are really digging in and looking at how the ideas about the Son of Heaven and the Nanjiao sacrifice actually were recorded, discussed, and the role that those played at the Nütten Dynasty court. And that is something, that I think is this big sort of problem that we have, is that we've got these ideas about something and we think it's not important, but we haven't really looked at the evidence for this thing. And if we do, I argue that we find it was very, very, very important. And so what we need to do, I think, is to really take this seriously, and then to try to rethink what we've thought about the 19th century, the Nütten Dynasty, the relations with the French, power balances, and all these other things. The Son of Heaven was real. The Nanjiao sacrifice was damn important. And all of this is stuff that we haven't taken seriously and we haven't looked at seriously.